If I select my texture paint button on this plane here, and we see in our zero brush menu over here, we can load a single brush, we can load a folder of brushes, and right next to here is our brush loading type. So by default, it's on default, which is just a standard brush, but tweaked to work well. And then we have the options Lotus Decal, Lotus Stencil, and Lotus Hard. So what a hard brush is if I press 5 and I press brush, and we're just on the standard load here, and I'll just select this first Bart texture here and press X to increase the size of my brush, and I just start drawing. One thing I noticed I started doing a lot was turning off the strength of my brush and increasing the hardness all the way up to 1, and also if my strength wasn't at 1, increasing that. So it was 3 different things I was doing to get the brush to lay down these layers really quickly. When the hardness is set all the way up to 1, Blender doesn't waste any time on trying to perform samples or anything like that. It just puts the image straight down to the object, which allows you to much more quickly lay down, a solid layer like this. So rather than do that every time I loaded a brush, or have to do that if I loaded a folder of brushes, I just first created this Lotus Hard. And we could have this like this and this on and all this mess, but then say we loaded up a new texture here, you see that it starts going on immediately. We have all the settings set up to where it'll be a nice hard brush that just gets down onto the image really quickly. So next in line, we have this Lotus Decal. And what Lotus Decal does is it changes between 5 to 10 different settings to make a brush, especially like if you have a transparent PNG image, work really well as a decal in both texture paint and sculpt modes. I'll change this to Lotus Decal, and I'll select brush, and I'm going to head to my desktop where I have some decals, basically just transparent PNGs, and I'll just pick this cloud one here. I forgot what I clicked on. Oh, I'm still on this plane. So let me switch to object mode, select this plane here, and then click the texture paint button, which allows me to then paint on it. So now with this decal brush, we can lay down decals just like this. So we can press X, of course, to increase the size of this, and Control X to rotate it around, or F if you prefer the Blender default. And so if I were to select this object mode button and select this Suzanne head and press the texture paint button so I can paint on it, we'll see what this looks like on a more 3D type object. When I drag this around, you see this lets me kind of see how this is going to look wherever I place this. So this does a couple other really important things too. First of all, it increases the hardness or the curve of the brush so that none of the edges are faded out. Secondly, it increases the size and aspect ratio of the image it's loading so that the entire square of the image remains square, get it? So the entire square of the image remains inside of the circle of the brush, so nothing's cut off. So as long as we're loading square images, they won't be stretched, they won't look weird, they'll go perfectly onto whatever we're putting them on as. So I'll go ahead and load this entire folder of decals by pressing brushes, and since I'm already inside the folder I want it to load, I'll just select brushes, and then when I press space, you'll see all the brushes that we have set as decal are prefaced with decal. So we have all the decal brushes we loaded right next to each other. And then I could select, say, this zero brush screen logo I was working on, which this one's actually white. So we might actually come in our brush settings and decrease the brightness all the way to 0. And then it's black so I can actually see it. And then we can put that wherever we want, which is pretty sweet. So this opens up a really cool avenue also when using ZeroBrush transparent layers. So I'll select my object button, select this plane over here, press the texture paint button, and I'll press add transparent. So now I have this completely transparent layer, and then if I press space and I'll select my cloud brush here, and I'll press Control Z, Control X to rotate them around, and you can actually hold Control when you press Control X to rotate your brush, so you can get a nice precise angle there. And so now I'm able to put stuff onto this transparent image, and it's pretty freaking cool and fun. So if I press my object mode button, I can then press G to move this down, and since this all works for cycles as well, so if I press Q and switch use cycles, we now have some really interesting stuff we can do. I'll press my texture paint button, and I'll press Control B to set up a render preview border, and turn on my quick lights, press the render preview, and I can see this in cycles. So there's a lot of really interesting, almost kind of After Effects styled animations and things you could do with this. You could really go nuts with a combination like this, which allows you to move so quickly. Press cycles to go back out of that. Finally, we have the type stencil. So if I come here and I select Lotus Stencil, and then I'll just load a single brush, and then I'm going to go back to my standard brush set here and just load a regular brush as a stencil. Like say for instance, I load this little building front here. You'll see that when we load a stencil brush in Blender, the default image, instead of being like down over to the left, is in the center, which is good, which is where you need it to be. And so I press X to change the size of this brush, and it might help if I was actually selected on this object. So I'm going to hold Alt and click on this object here, which holding Alt and selecting something allows you to select it even if you're in texture paint mode. Then I'll click back on texture paint, and I'll start drawing this window on here, and we can just use this like a stencil. We get some other nice little options when we add a stencil. First of all, we get little reminders that tell us how to move this. So you can move the stencil with your right mouse button, you can scale it with shift right mouse button, and you can hold Control and hold your right mouse button to rotate it directly, or you can press Control X to rotate it that way, which is what I usually prefer. And if you have it all over somewhere crazy, you can just press Center, which recenters your stencil. And if you're using a texture mask, like so if I go over to Tools and under Texture Mask, I selected one of these other brushes I loaded as a texture mask or something, then this will sync the mask image and your stencil image to wherever they are and to the same scale, so it's much more usable.